Tom, would you like to make the introductions? Tom, would you like to make the introductions, or shall I? Oh, it's one of those days. I think we've lost Ton. Let me make the introductions. Today we're delighted to have Marilyn Scott talking about Bevis Marks Synagogue Story, celebrating over 300 years. First of all, though, I would like to invite my rabbi, Rabbi Shalom Morris of Bevis Marks, to make a few introductory comments.
Good evening, David, and thank you for that welcome, and good evening to everyone that's tuned in today. I see some familiar faces, even from as far away as Curacao. So it's wonderful that you were all able to attend tonight. In just a moment, I'll hand back to David, who can give Marilyn, her proper introduction. But I really just wanted to open by saying that, obviously, as well known to all of you who are attending, Bevis Marks Synagogue is, one of the jewels of the Jewish world. Obviously, to the Sephardic community, it has exceptional significance. But the truth is that it is a synagogue of remarkable importance to the Jewish story. In that it's the oldest synagogue, as is well known in the United Kingdom, dating back to 1701, but it has been in continuous use from the day that it was opened, and we believe that makes it unique in the Jewish world, in that it has been in continuous use for over 320 years, probably unlike any other synagogue in the world. And that's due to many factors, such as obviously the Holocaust, the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands, obviously the relative newness of the Americas. But what that's allowed the community to do is to preserve its traditions and its collections and its oral history in a way which is hard to imagine any place else, simply because it's always been there. And the families have been able to pass the traditions and all of its collections from generation to generation without interruption over those centuries. And I'll talk at the end a bit about life at Bevis Marks today, but I'll just state at this point that when one enters into Bevis Marks, and for those of you that have been here before, you'll know what I'm saying is true, one has a palpable sense of that history. There is an overwhelming sense of the in the atmosphere of the synagogue that really transports a person back to the 18th century and to a deep sense of Jewish connection. And that is something that you can't simply create. It's something that has to develop over time, and something that only can happen over the centuries. And so, somebody like David, who attends synagogue regularly, it's why people like David continue to come, because there is an experience of being there, which is surreal. Absolutely magnificent and magical. And really the objective of this project that Marilyn is going to share with you more about is the opportunity for the Bevis Marks Synagogue community to share this heritage with a wider audience, Jewish and non-Jewish, both locally and hopefully internationally as well. So that while so much of the collection has been hidden, and so much of the, shall we say, the heritage of the community has been on some level almost off limits to people for such a long time, this is really an opportunity for Bevis Marks to ensure that it is an experience and heritage that will be available to anybody who wishes to enjoy it and to experience it and to connect with it and ultimately, hopefully, to be inspired by it. So this is a very exciting time, and there's other exciting developments that I'll speak about at the end. But this really is the culmination of nearly, not quite, but nearly getting on a decade of work. And so it's a very exciting moment in the history, and it's hard to have an exciting moment in history of a community that's been around for over 300 years. But that indeed is the case. And so we're thrilled to be able to share it with you, and thrilled to have people like Marilyn as part of the team that is leading the development and ultimately the staging of this new chapter in the history of the synagogue. So thank you, Marilyn. Yeah, I've said it to you before, but thank you publicly for all that you are doing, and thank you to David and Tom for inviting us to share this with you tonight.
David, I can't hear you.
So it's muted. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us also, because obviously I know you've been unwell over the last few days. Tom, would you like to make the introductions?
Hi, everyone. This is Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible, and we welcome our viewers on YouTube. This will be a very special meeting, supported by the UK's National Lottery. A new development at London's Bevis Marks Synagogue includes a new visitor centre. Marilyn Scott, the advisor to the project, will tell all about it. And she has been charged with both preserving the fabric and collections of the 300-year-old synagogue, while making it accessible to a general audience. And she will discuss the unique challenges of this project. Welcome, Marilyn, and thank you for Shalom Morris for his introduction.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to share the absolute delight and excitement we all have in this project. So I'm going to talk to you this evening about a really exciting new visitor attraction in the City of London. It's a brand new visitor centre. However, as Shalom has said, it was built in 1701. So the new NLHF-supported visitor centre at Bevis Marks is due to open later on this year. In June 2019, the synagogue was awarded £2.7 million by the National Lottery Heritage Fund towards the cost of significant conservation at the synagogue and a brand new cultural centre. A major role for the visitor centre will be to invite people of all ages to learn the history and traditions of the Jewish religion. Learning and engagement with our audience is key to the activity for the visitor centre. It will be open to all, including adult groups who can tour the synagogue, attend programmes of talks, lectures, musical events, visit the cafe and the historic displays all year round. In particular, we're going to welcome young people from schools all over London and indeed the UK. Bevis Marks will welcome pupils from schools representing other faiths or no faith, and of course will engage with Jewish schools. The school groups will have a visit to the synagogue for a special guided tour, which will explain all of the different items, all of the different traditions within the synagogue. They will then move into the visitor centre and look at displays where they'll be able to understand the fascinating history of Bevis Marks in the city, and indeed its importance in the history of the Jewish religion, but in European religion generally. Bevis Marks, as I'm sure many of you know, is located off the street called Bevis Marks in Aldgate. As Rabbi Morris has said, it's the oldest synagogue in the UK in continuous use. Built in 1701, it's the only synagogue in Europe that has had continuous worship for over 300 years. And Rabbi Morris himself took great pains during the COVID pandemics of 2020 and 2021, when people couldn't gather in the synagogue. He led online worship to ensure that this continuous tradition of worship was not stopped. The Spanish and Portuguese community at Bevis is very proud of its special relationship with the City of London. They were the first Jews allowed to resettle in the country in the mid-17th century and lived and worshipped on the eastern edge of the Square Mile. Families still connected with the synagogue today can trace their heritage back to the late 17th century, being allowed to practice their faith and live in peace for over 360 years. But the story of the S&P community is much older. Jews were in Spain during Roman times. In 1492, they were expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella and went into exile. Many Jews settled in North Africa, but also in Portugal. However, the persecution of the Inquisition, which was to follow on, lasted for 200 years. A small group settled in London in Elizabethan times, but in 1635, a wine merchant came to settle in London from Portugal. Oliver Cromwell, at that time, encouraged merchants to come and settle in the UK because, of course, it helped with the prosperity of the country that he had taken over following the execution of Charles I. Charles II, after his restitution, went on to protect this community, giving now a longevity which we've already spoken about. But this great tradition all began somewhere else. Services at a small synagogue in Creechurch Lane, which was almost like a private house, date to 1657. And in October 1663, it was visited by the diarist Samuel Pepys, who recorded in his diary the impression of the service. We know Pepys also visited in December 1659 on the occasion of a memorial service for a wealthy and respected merchant. This, you will see, is a small plaque on Cunard House, a contemporary building now on that site. It's at the corner of Creechurch Lane and Berry Street. The synagogue subsequently became a workhouse and was demolished in 1857. Outwardly, the group who met here, who were mainly merchants, were seen as Spaniards and identified as Catholics, but they held prayer meetings at Creechurch Lane and were soon accepted by the government as Jewish in their faith. An increase in the number of Sephardic Jews to a community of around 1,000 made it necessary to find somewhere larger, and the planning of a new synagogue began. With an agreement being signed in 1699 with Joseph Avis, a Quaker, who quoted for the construction of the building £2,650, a very large amount of money in the late 17th century. The synagogue was sited in a courtyard behind gates, and we read, it was decently contrived to avoid offence. At this time, a quarter of the population in this part of London were Jewish. Around the synagogue, there grew up community buildings, including a school and a bathhouse, and a flourishing Jewish community surrounded the synagogue. This painting is one of the only surviving items from that first synagogue, Moses and Aaron with the 10 Commandments, by an artist, Aaron de Chavez, and it's dated to 1675. We also have in Bevis Marks Synagogue today some of the plain wooden benches that came from Church Lane, and also recently discovered in the British Museum a wedding ring used at a service in Church Lane. And we hope to have that on display on loan from the British Museum. The interior decor, furnishing and layout reflect the influence of the great Portuguese synagogue of Amsterdam of 1675. Despite a fire in the 18th century when the roof was destroyed but subsequently replaced, despite the London Blitz, which of course partially damaged St Paul's Cathedral very close by, and in the 1970s an IRA bomb, the synagogue remains almost totally unchanged since its first building in the late 17th century. 7 hanging brass candelabra symbolize the 7 days of the week, the largest of which represents the Sabbath. A prominent feature of the synagogue is the Renaissance-style ark containing the Torah scrolls, located at the center of the east wall of the building. Painted to look like Italian marble, it is in fact made entirely of oak, and it reflects the design found in many Wren city churches. It of course looks directly to Jerusalem. When I mentioned right at the very beginning the restoration, this is really the first part of the project, which we have been undertaking since 2019. And it has involved not changing the synagogue in any way, but simply restoring features and helping us to understand the construction of many elements of the synagogue better. For example, the clock, which sits above the entrance to the synagogue. The restoration has revealed to us, in fact, how simple the mechanism of the clock is, but it is now full working order, has been beautifully cleaned, and is now back in pride of place. This is the kind of work that has been undertaken at the synagogue. And we've also discovered many really interesting features of the synagogue by simply looking more closely. And inside of the ark is this wonderful gilded leather wallpaper, which lines the whole of the inside of the ark. And we are working very hard at the moment with a number of experts, including a Dutch expert on gilded leather, to date this and to find out whether indeed it does date from 1701, from that really early period. So that would be incredibly exciting, and it would be amongst some of the earliest gilded leather wall hangings in this country. So watch this space. We hope that we're going to be able to find out definitively. But just to give you an example of the kind of work that's been happening in the synagogue, the ingress of damp over many, many years has impacted badly on the plaster walls, on the paintwork. So we're putting all these things right. You can see here the kind of damage that we're talking about. And of course, behind that lies damp inside the brickwork, which ultimately would, of course, cause really serious damage to the walls of the synagogue. So this is all now really ensuring that the future of the synagogue for years and years to come, at least the next 100 years, the synagogue will be safe and no further problems will occur. You see, this is the kind of thing because of ingress of damp through the roof, and obviously the damage that occurred during the IRA bomb, because the synagogue really was very, very quickly restored after that considerable damage. There were some areas which were never completely put right. So again, all of that work has happened. But there's also quite a lot about the work to the synagogue that will make it much better for visitors, for the congregation. As those of you who know Bevis well, you will know that moving around the synagogue has not been the easiest. There are many changes of level, very, very difficult to get a wheelchair into the synagogue. So what the project will do is to put in a new lift, which will enable movement from the ladies' gallery right down to the basement area. So all of these small staircases will be replaced by a beautiful staircase, but also by a modern lift, which will make access much, much better. We've had some amazing craftsmen working on the synagogue. Here you can see the re-gilding of the ceiling bosses. And this work has taken a very long time. Obviously, COVID impacted really seriously on the project, but by the nature of the work, it's not a quick fix. To work on the ceiling bosses, we had to have a whole floor built in order that the craftsmen could get up close to the ceiling bosses to do that work. So really not insubstantial in the way that work has been done. And you can see here the example on the left, quite a heavy Victorian treatment of the ceiling bosses. On the right, what now sits there, much more delicate and has gone back to the original painting scheme. Interesting to see that this represents oak leaves and ostrich feathers, which were the symbols of Charles II. So it shows this was a mark of gratitude of the community to Charles II for his tolerance and his support for the Jewish faith. So just a really interesting little touch there. And again, showing where a rather unsightly curtain rail above the window on the left has been removed. That again was probably a Victorian addition and restored right back to the original paint scheme and the gilding redone. The gilding in the synagogue just gleams. It looks absolutely amazing now that all the regilding has been done. It's really very, very beautiful. So, the new visitor centre, what will it be? Well, referencing back to my point on access, it will introduce a ramp from the courtyard, which will allow level access into the synagogue. You can see just in front there in the artist's impression, a glass-fronted entrance area. That will be the reception with a small cafe, a small shop, a desk where you can buy tickets. You'll be able to rent an audio guide, and it will also allow level access into the synagogue. So this project has a double benefit. It benefits the congregation themselves, and it also benefits visitors. So makes access a lot easier and provides an introductory area which will explain the whole fascinating history of the synagogue. The reception area will lead into a gallery, and here we can begin to display the treasures of the synagogue. You can see just to the right-hand side another gallery which will double up as a meeting room, a room for lectures, a room for talks, all other kinds of events, and also an introductory film on the history of the synagogue. As those of you who know Bevis well, you will know there isn't a lot of space other than the synagogue. And so we were faced with a real challenge as to how to display all of the wonderful treasures, which I'll go on to talk about in a moment. But we hit on an idea. Below the synagogue was an area previously used as a store, a brick vault. Actually, the brickwork is absolutely beautiful. And we hit on the idea of using this as another display space. But of course, because it was a vault, it didn't have adequate head height. So we've excavated down to create a new space which will have sufficient headroom to make it a comfortable display space. But it will also actually take visitors into an area below the synagogue where they would never usually visit. So we're leaving the brickwork absolutely bare as it is. And I think it's going to be a really atmospheric and amazing area. So you can see it coming into shape. That's pretty much as it is at the moment. A new floor has been laid and it will soon be fitted out with state-of-the-art, beautiful showcases, lovely lighting, really allowing us to show off the absolute treasures of the synagogue. So this is an artist's impression of what it will look like after completion. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the showcases I spoke about. So in addition to being the oldest synagogue in continuous use in Europe, Bevis has a remarkable collection of items relating to the history of the Jewish faith and the community. All of these items will be available for visitors to see when the new visitor centre opens later this year. The showcases will also have some built-in storage, so we will be able to have all the collection available for researchers and those wanting to look at all of the items. The silver collection is particularly fine, and we have had a number of experts looking at the silver collection, and they feel it is one of the best of its kind in the world. It is quite remarkable, dating back from the foundation of the synagogue in 1701. And we have some very rare items in the collection. All of these items have been in store for many generations, and this will be the first opportunity to bring them all together. We also have textiles, paintings, remarkable archives, photographs, and records tracing the history of the community from the 17th century. The archives are particularly exciting. They are now all residing at the London Metropolitan Archive. I don't need to speak to a genealogical society about how important archives are, but as you know, they are particularly difficult to care for. So the London Metropolitan Archive keep them for us, they keep them in the right conditions, but they are readily available. You can make an appointment and they are incredibly helpful and very, very knowledgeable. So we obviously have records of births, burials, marriages, but we have account books, an example of one of these here. We have school records, orphanage records, correspondence dating from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. It is an absolute joy to be able to look at these archives, and they tell so many fantastic and fascinating stories. Another one here, a handwritten record. Many are in Portuguese or in Hebrew, and they have all been catalogued by the London Metropolitan Archive, but obviously they are an amazing source for research, and we hope that as a continuation of the project, we're going to be able to digitise some of the records, but also to do further research into areas of the history of the synagogue. So lots and lots more work to be done, particularly with the archives. I'll now give you a glimpse, and this is literally a glimpse of some of the finest items in the collection. This is an absolutely beautiful spice box, Dutch, 1680. It was dedicated by Isaac de Elias Lindo in 1740. And of course, the Lindo family being one of the oldest Sephardic families in England. But an absolute treasure, and will go into the showcase, so will be seen by everyone. This is an example of the wonderful collection of 18th century Torah finials or rimonim. They're used, of course, to decorate the Torah scrolls in the synagogue. Extremely decorative, these very much reflecting the Dutch architectural style. These, along with many other pairs of rimonim, will go into the display in the synagogue. These, although of Dutch style, interestingly, are English, by Samuel Wasdell, 1712. absolutely beautiful. And now they've all been cleaned, so they really are looking very, very special. This is a silver Kiddush cup, dated 1863, and those are the Montefiore arms that you can see on the cup. Again, we have many other similar examples. Some of the finest silver items have an interesting connection with the Lord Mayor of London and the city. The synagogue has always highly valued its position in the heart of the city, and this manifested itself through an annual gift each year from the synagogue to the Lord Mayor. This item is English silver by Robert Hill, made in London in 1728, and presented to Sir Edward Beecher, who was Lord Mayor at the time. You can see there the tent of meeting symbol in the centre. This is a London seal of the synagogue dating from 1800. And the detail on these items is still as fresh as the day they were made. Because, of course, so many of these items were in store for at least the last 100 years. There's been very little wear or damage to them. They are all in absolutely amazing condition. A Torah crown, one of a pair. We have a large number of these crowns, some of them with semi-precious stones, others with engravings. And just to show you what I mean by the cleaning process that's been going on, we've been working with a conservator, and she has cleaned all of the silver. On the left-hand side, you can see the result of the cleaning, and on the right-hand side, dirt, tarnish, little bit of wear, but with some very, very light cleaning, these objects have come back to the kind of condition they would have been in 300 years ago. So it's been a delight to watch this process and to see how wonderful these objects really are. And finally, the vestments or Torah cloaks. We have in excess of 200 of these, varying in design, varying in age, varying in material, all of them really quite remarkable. We're not going to be able to show many of them because they obviously have to be specially displayed. They take up quite a lot of room. But what we hope to do is on our new website, which is under construction at the moment, we hope to be able to have digital representations, photographs of every item in the collection. So you'll be able to go onto the website and look at all of the collection, which we hope will in some small way make up for us not being able to show as much as we would like to. We'd love to show everything. And you can see in this close-up the quality of the embroidery, the gold thread work, very, very heavy. Many of the Torah cloaks are extremely heavy, and the work in them is just quite amazing. I could have shown you 20 or 30 more images. I wish I could have done, but time this evening is against us if we are to leave time for some questions. So I hope that's given you an opportunity to get excited, to anticipate the opening of the visitor centre and to be able to view all these wonderful things up close. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity this evening to talk to you about our project.
Thank you very much. That was awesome. Shall we have questions now, or Rabbi Morris, do you want to say some words now?
I'll just say a couple things now, and then we'll take questions in case anyone has anything they'd like to ask me. So first of all, thank you, Marilyn. That was great. I'm intimately involved with the project. I'm feeling even more excited having just heard your talk. There's a lot more even beyond obviously what Marilyn showed you. And within kind of the displays and the stories and the videos, we've taken great effort to kind of show and to talk about both kind of the stories of, shall we say, the kinds of people you'd expect to appear, the famous and the leaders, the chachamim, the rabbis of the community, but also the women of the community. We've gone to great effort to ensure that they are appropriately highlighted, despite the fact that in kind of many of the, shall we say, standard histories, women and the poor would not make much of an appearance. They will through the research that was done for this project. So we hope that this will really give people a kind of a holistic, kind of comprehensive immersion into the hundreds of years of the history of the community through whether it's objects, text, images, and so forth. So it's going to be a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful visit for everyone. The part though about the project, which is I think also important to emphasize, is that this is really done as part of the synagogue. It's the same charity ultimately. There's as part of the charity of the S&P Sephardi community here in London, and so the project is works incredibly closely with the synagogue and the community, and much of what the project has built will double as space for the community, and so there will be places for dinners and kiddushim, gatherings with weddings and so forth. So it's really going to be something that will also enhance the life of the community. And that's something which ultimately is the most important and paramount, obviously, from the synagogue's perspective, is that, we don't just remain a place with a glorious history, but hopefully an even more important future. There are some exciting things that are happening together with this that we hope will make a visit for people even more meaningful, particularly those who'd like to spend a weekend, to spend a Shabbat at the synagogue, to actually experience the services, the carefully preserved Spanish and Portuguese services that we maintain at Bevis Marks, with all the traditions and melodies, and it's really quite an amazing experience. So what we're going to be having is meals, Shabbat meals for visitors that will be available, Friday night dinners and lunches, so people can really, in that way, comfortably spend Shabbat in our area, despite the fact that this is not, the area where the Jewish community largely lives anymore, though of course Jewish people still do live in the area. And also a interesting project we've been doing has been to build a roof in central London, something that hasn't been done before. And so that's something, again, to kind of facilitate and make it more pleasant for people who want to spend the weekend in the area, who, whether with children or want to go touring around as well, and, carry things for those for whom that's important, to also make that something available too. And so essentially all of these things will benefit both the visitor center and shall we say that the worshiping community at Bevis Marks too. And we hope that together, both elements of Bevis Marks, both the visitor side and the community side will be enhanced and enriched by all of the benefits that will come from this new era or stage in the history of the community. So it is a exceptionally exciting time for us. We've been working on it for years. COVID has been feels like in some ways we had a long COVID because obviously ongoing building works has limited some of the functionality of our community spaces. So kind of the experience of what happened with COVID of things shutting down has, for us, somewhat been maintained post-COVID. But we hope that this long COVID is going to ultimately give birth to a very exciting new chapter. And I'll just say from, with my hat as the rabbi, you are all most welcome. And we really look forward to welcoming you and hoping that you are as moved and inspired and excited by Bevis Marks as those of us who are able to be there on a weekly basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask, do we actually get to use the silver, or does it just completely stay in the cabinets the whole time?
It actually is our hope that we will, now that we have the silver on site, that we will be able to use it for special occasions. So perhaps a particular set of Rimonim we will use on Pesach, and another pair we can use on Rosh Hashanah, and so forth, as well as many objects that actually we currently still use regularly that will go into the displays. We'll obviously pull them out as we need them, whether it's, the lamp for Hanukkah or the black objects that we use on Tisha B'Av. Hopefully we won't have to use those in the future, but, be it as it may, that obviously we will continue to function and hopefully not only use the things we currently use, but be able to even, on special occasions, use these things once again, which ultimately, I think that's the point, David, is that we're not a museum.
Exactly.
We're a living community. And so it'll be nice to finally be able to kind of be even more alive than we have been.
Thank you. On the subject of Tisha B'Av, can I just remind people that that's a few days before the start of the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies conferences in London. So if people want to come a little bit early, that's a very special service. Also, I'm not sure who this is a question to, or if it's just a statement, but I think both Rabbi Morris and Marilyn are aware of the Anasal Hebraica project, where we're using artificial intelligence to read the accounts books that have been digitized by the National Library of Israel. I wonder if it's possible to offer a wish list for what might be digitized next. Because that would obviously help research a lot. And just to observe that the ketubot in the London Metropolitan Archives, I think, are suffering through overuse. So as soon as they can be digitized, perhaps the better to preserve them. But that's just obviously a personal opinion. Ton, do you have a statement or questions or? Ton is muted. So Francis.
Oh, one moment.
I was unmuted.
Sorry. I have a statement about Aaron de Chavez, the painter of that beautiful painting in the beginning of Aaron and Moses. He was from Holland, and we found out where he learned his craft. And this was with the Dutch painter Jan Lievens. And Jan Lievens in his time was as famous as Rembrandt. And even more so, he worked with Rembrandt in his youth in Leiden. They even possibly shared an atelier. So Lievens was very much influenced by Rembrandt, but also vice versa. So we now have a link between Aaron de Chavez and Jan Lievens and Rembrandt. And we know that he was a pupil of Jan Lievens through a notarial deed from 1669. And we know that Aaron de Chavez was his pupil for some years. But Jan Lievens died in 1674. So maybe that this was the reason that Aaron de Chavez left for London, because in that year he painted that painting. So that was it. Questions? Frances?
Yes, because I do theatre, as you know, I keep going on about it. What I'm really interested... Stop laughing, David. I'm really interested in how people lived in terms of post-English Revolution, which has always been something I've looked at a lot, you know, from Shakespeare right through to the kind of cultural effects of it. How did people actually live in terms of class, safety? What were they doing? Because because of what Cromwell did, which was welcome them back very sensibly, really, because Cromwell was surprisingly sensible in many, many ways, unlike a lot of other people like Charles I. How did they actually live? What was it like to return? Are there any records of that? Anybody who wrote anything down or passed that down to their families? And the different ways of being well off or not well off, and surviving or being a craftsperson, what were they up to? Do you know? Is there any book I can read about it? Can't hear you.
Is that a question for Marilyn, or for the rabbi, or for anybody?
Anybody who can answer it, please. Probably the rabbi or Marilyn, but you must, Marilyn, have seen, as you did all that research, how people were living, what level they were living at, what the class differences were in the community, who relied upon whom, how safe was it, etc., 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 etc. Marilyn.
Well, the rabbi's probably better or well able to answer this, but I would just say, from my point of view of having spent quite a lot of time at LMA and looked at things, I mean, that quote I gave about decently contrived to avoid offence. Yes. I think they kept themselves quite to themselves, which is why they created a community within the city with their own school, their own support for older people, etc., because they didn't want to, I think, being very conscious of their history, they didn't want to get into conflict with anybody. They wanted to be able to live their own lives peacefully. In terms of class, I mean, in some ways, has it always been thus? There were wealthy merchants who were doing very well and could commission things like the silver we've just seen, which were very, very costly. And there were equally, at the other end of the spectrum, there were children sent to the orphanage because their parents were unable to care for them. There were those people who were supported with food. So the spectrum of wealth was as it was for the whole country, really. It wasn't a particularly wealthy Jewish community, but there were wealthy merchants. And I think that area of the city, as we all know, because of the Huguenot influx, that was a particularly creative area of London. And therefore, yes, there were many Jewish creative people working there, working in silver, working in textiles. So I think in some ways, the Bevis community was a microcosm of what was happening in the rest of London. But
And you, like, I mean, I was just watching the Sephardic Genealogical Society thing which was about Europe and the different places in which Jewish communities were around these times and onwards in Europe. Very interesting. In Holland and different places where it was better and other places where it was worse. Were they all in contact with each other?
oh yes, I mean the families were spread across. Some of the family would come from Holland to the UK. Others went much further. So I think that Sephardic families, as they are indeed today, were spread throughout the world.
Yes, well, mine cantered across from Egypt in 1922. So, yes, I saw it happening. Yes, fine, okay. So there was would you call it an integration, that the Sephardim were fairly good at putting themselves into the community, while the Ashkenazim were in a different position. I'm not blaming them at all. I think it looks as if the different conditions in different parts of Europe and the world had a huge effect on how the Jews lived.
Yes, and I think you have to remember that and the example I gave of giving a gift to the Lord Mayor of London each year from the community shows they wanted to be accepted, but they weren't going to push themselves. They were going to do it by much more subtle ways.
Clever, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to Bernard, could I just ask what sort of general narrative is being told in terms of presenting the visitor center? That's to say, are we just what's happened before the Ashkenazim, or are we tied into the whole sort of Portuguese story, or is it an Anglo-Jewish story, or is it this was the first ethnic religious minority, or is it just a presentation of artifacts?
It isn't just a presentation of artifacts, and we have tried very hard not to go for a chronological storytelling. We have tried to go for something much more thematic. So we talk about how the community, exactly as we've been saying, how the community worked at integration, and how the community made contribution to the life of the city, the life of the UK. So it is much more around how people lived their lives, but also how they impacted more widely. It definitely isn't in 1653, this happened, in 1679, this happened, etc. We're not going for that view of history. In the reception area, which I showed you, there will be a timeline. So when visitors come, having absolutely no idea about the history of the Jewish faith in the UK, they will have a timeline. But once they enter the visitor centre and they begin to look at the artifacts, they are much more about themes. How did integration happen? How was the community accepted? And this whole story of other Sephardic groups around the world. How was that relationship maintained, and how was Bevis actually at the centre of many of those really important developments in other parts of the world?
Thank you. So your focus is mostly sort of early modern period. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's good. It would be nice, perhaps. But you said there's an exhibition space at some point. We can squeeze in the Iraqis and others, because I think that's also an interesting story as well. But thank you for that, Bernard.
But
I'm
I'd
sorry.
say one more thing. If you would like, I make theatre. I make community and political and personal theatre around issues and needs and interests and move. If you would like me to do anything, I would love to come in.
Thank you.
Asking to be paid, I would do it for fun, though I do get paid sometimes. But if you would like that, I'll send you a link and we could think
Thank
about it. I
you.
would love to do that work.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Bernard, I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
That's okay. First of all, I apologize if the question I'm about to ask was answered at the beginning, but I was on my way home from being discharged from hospital and missed probably the first 20 minutes. It was a thrilling presentation from what I did catch, and I'm really excited about what's going to happen. My question, which sort of ties in with the previous questions, but in a different way, is about Bevis Marks and the rest of the world, and the rest of the world and Bevis Marks. Because although this is described as a visitor center, it's effectively going to be the Museum of Sephardic History in the UK in various ways. And I wondered about the relationship between the visitor center and, I'll say, similar organizations or bodies, but I'm thinking of museums and cultural spaces and religious spaces, and particularly, obviously, Sephardic ones around the world, whether or not you're going to, whether or you've already thought about how you might do it, coordinate, exchange, run mutual exhibitions and so on, and how that will work, because in its new manifestation, the Jewish Museum is basically cutting out a lot of its international activity and sharing and focusing much more on local issues. And I think just by the nature of the history of the Sephardic Jews in London, I think there is a whole world out there to connect with, and with whom to exchange both exhibitions and information. So my question is, have you thought about it? How will you be doing it? And if you've answered it before I came in, I apologize.
No, we haven't answered it. We very much want Bevis to be a place that attracts an international audience. That is very, very important to us. So I think it's early days, we're not open yet, but we certainly will make those connections. We've had a lot of help from Amsterdam, from the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam, and the synagogue, the great synagogue in Amsterdam, in our planning for the visitor centre. We recently had a large group visit from the US, and that will obviously be really important to us to bring American visitors who come to London a lot anyway. But certainly, yes, trying to make those international links is something we're very, very keen to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Ton and I know a lot of them, so perhaps we can help with that. Don, would you like to unmute?
Yeah.
Hello. I visited Bevis Marks Synagogue several years ago for a Shabbat service, and I was shown records of my great-grandparents' wedding in Bevis Marks in the 1840s. And I'm also trying to do a great deal of family research. I wonder when your records will be made available electronically, so that I can, I know several of my ancestors, I can trace my family back to 1670 in London. And I'm sure that many of my ancestors' records are there. I'm curious to know when you think they'll be made available so I can access them from the US.
Digitization is something very high on our agenda. It wasn't part of the current project because the current project was very focused towards the restoration of the synagogue and the new visitor centre. But it's definitely something that we will be following up. I mean, there are a couple of people on this attending this talk. Kevin, I think you're on the call, but there are people on this call who probably have some good information about where already you are able to access certain records, not all of them by any means.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ron, if you'll forgive me on that particular point, if I can just jump straight to David Silvera. I don't know if his question is related to that.
It really isn't. Okay. But I can share Don's frustration because I'm also trying to connect with ancestors that were in Jamaica in 1684 that very likely came out of London. And I know one was circumcised in 1694, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm deep into the archives that are scanned but not transcribed, and that's a different topic. But I really wanted to talk to Marilyn, ask a question to Marilyn, because one of the things that fascinated me in all of this is the strength of the organization structure of the Spanish Portuguese. And through Amsterdam, the same thread through Amsterdam and through Brazil, through even Jamaica and Curacao, where you have a very strong mamad and a rabbinic structure, which in many cases had to survive in an environment where other religions were supported by the church, and the churches were supported by the monarchies, and the monarchies supported the churches. So there was this relationship of financial and control relationship, and you had to try and survive in that kind of environment. And what fascinated me is the structure that they came up with and the way that they organized them. This community was organized, and I saw it in looking at Hamburg records too, making sure that the individuals didn't behave badly in public. They made sure that they didn't do illegal things. They took care of the poor and they took care of the sick, and to a very large extent. And then they paid people to leave when they couldn't do any more. And I'm seeing that of course, in Bevis Marks records, and I saw it in looking in Hamburg and in Amsterdam. So is any of this coming out in what you're talking about? Because it really is. It's so different from the way the other religions and monarchies were organized and governments were organized, and it was I think, very classic and extraordinary way of survival.
Shalom, is there anything you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, thanks, David, because what you asked about, I think, relates as well to what Francis was asking about, and the answer is that directly is that yes, we're going to be addressing that in the visitor center. We have a whole, shall we say, theme or section within the visitor center, which is about the charitable works of the community, and to talk about kind of the extensive networks of charity the community maintained, for whether it was for the sick or for the elderly, or for the poor children and so forth, and to appreciate that essentially because the community didn't have, shall we say, that structure of society, essentially had to create it itself. So this is really at a time where you think of the various parishes, and every local parish would essentially provide these services for those living in their local parish. But Jews obviously would not have been part of that. And so there was a sense of kind of this expectation that Jews would take care of themselves and would not become kind of a burden or kind of have this problem of all these destitute, needy Jews kind of spilling out, onto the rest of society. It's part of that, though. It kind of is a balance that is important to appreciate. In London, there never, during this time, there's no Jewish ghetto. Jews live in the same area because of obviously ease, but there's no ghetto. There's no kind of restrictions on Jews in that kind of way. They have exceptional rights, and you kind of contrast that with kind of the unfortunate situation of Jews in some other places. It fits into a lot of what some historians refer to as the port Jews and kind of the exceptional rights that Jews often had in port cities. But that's, a broader thing. But just to say that the community did maintain a whole network of charities in order to provide for their members. And we're going to be tracing that and talking about that, not only in the early modern period, but even moving into the modern period. So the focus of the visitor center will be primarily on kind of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Obviously, once you move into the 20th century, it's kind of a different phase in the history of London's S&P Sephardi community. But there will be elements that obviously do address even into that era, but that won't be, shall we say, the focus of its activity, because we're trying to remain as focused as possible on Bevis Marks Synagogue and not just become kind of a Jewish museum, kind of talking about all the developments that happen, in British Jewry, throughout its entire history. So it's been an interesting tightrope, walk, trying to figure out exactly what elements to focus on to capture the important story of the community, but also the values and kind of the ethos that come out of its history. So I hope that addresses.
I just add, it was the outreach certainly the 18th century, 17th, 18th century was into Jamaica was amazing, and went into other places. If you look at wills, and I can see some of my ancestral wills, the community was first of all sending money to synagogues in Jamaica, but also to London, and they send them to relatives in Bayonne, and then they would mention the charities, the orphans charities, and so on, the whole structure that would in Jamaica, which is a long way away from London,
So the part that'll be interesting, one of the things obviously is that people often think of, Amsterdam as the mother community, kind of the Western Sephardim. And that's true on some level, but that's, shall we say, specifically true, particularly within the Dutch Western Sephardic communities. Right. Once you talk about the English Western Sephardic communities, London basically assumes that role. Right. And so as you kind of look in the 18th and 19th century, London is playing that role in terms of, and we have the records of the correspondence between the Mahamad in London and the other English Western Sephardic communities. And so you really kind of can see through some of the records, and we'll talk about that through some of the things we're going to be displaying, is kind of the international reach, its role in setting up the Jewish community in Savannah, correspondence, rabbinic advice that they offered to the community in Jamaica on certain occasions. So there will be that element of the international component too, which you can also see through some of the objects, for example, objects that have come from Barbados that will be on display in the visitor center. So lots of interesting things that will come out, I think.
Sorry to have kept you waiting.
Not a problem. Not a problem at all, Todd. First of all, my compliments on the presentation. It's wonderful also to see Rabbi Shalom Aromi. Morris back face to face. So I want to actually go back, if I may, to the synagogue itself, or the Bevis Marks synagogues themselves. We know that Curacao and Amsterdam and 3 other Dutch-related synagogues have sand on the floor, or had sand on the floor. And my question is that also been the case at Bevis Marks? We know that Manasseh ben Israel from Holland was very instrumental with Cromwell to open up for Jews again. So I was wondering whether that, in any case, at any point also resulted in a layer of sand on the floor, as we have on these 5 Dutch-related synagogues.
I don't know.
Ron, you will not find a drop of sand on our floor. It is kept pristine and clean.
Even back then. I mean, I'm not asking about now.
I don't
I'm talking
know.
about-
I don't know. All I know is before you walk into the synagogue, there are boot scrapers. So I think they wanted to keep the synagogue clean. As far as I know, there wasn't sand
Okay.
on the floors. Certainly not in the way that you find in Curacao, but I, as far as I know, not even in the way that you kind of have a bit of, grit on the floor in Amsterdam. But I don't know. That's the floorboards is one of the only things that has changed in the synagogue. They were replaced a couple of decades ago because they were rotting. So that we do have some original floorboards on kind of the sides of the synagogue, but the main floorboards are replaced. As far as I know, I don't think that has been the case here, the way it was in other places.
In Holland, there was actually, as I understand it, the practice in the 17th century in homes with wooden floors. So actually have a thin layer of sand to be able to take dirt out. And I think you told me also drippings of candles. And that's why I was wondering whether it might have also been exported to London or not. But anyway, thanks a lot. If you ever come across it, I'd love to hear about it.
Well, are there plans in Curacao for another museum?
Well, there are. The Jewish museum we have, which my compliments, Marilyn, sounds very much like what you have there, and it happens to be right next to the synagogue or connected to the synagogue. So it also functions for the function that you're mentioning. But yes, we're expanding the museum in the next, I'd say 12 to 15 months to include what we've called a war annex. It's going to have an Anne Frank exposition in cooperation with Anne Frank House. It's going to have an exposition by George Maduro, who is a Curaçaoan hero during the World War in Holland. It's going to have life of in Curaçao during the Second World War. So the museum is actually going to expand beyond only what is Curaçao jewelry into Curaçao connected experiences during the World War.
Interesting.
David, any questions on YouTube?
Yeah, well, yes, there are. Let me just. We have a question which, for the sake of full disclosure, comes from a member of the S&P Vestments committee. Will displays cover only the first 200 years, i.e. before Lauderdale Road began in 1896 and most S&P members started worshipping there?
Well, with the vestments, as I explained, because of space limitation, we are only going to be able to display 4 or 5 of the Torah cloaks. So the plan is to actually rotate them, which will also be much better for the vestments because it will be better for their preservation. So we don't have a particular cut-off date. We're not only going to show 18th century vestments, for example. We hope that we're going to be able to show a whole range going right up to some of the wonderful 19th century vestments that we have. So the answer is there isn't a particular cut-off date.
Yeah. Can I quickly ask a personal question? The new carpet is green. The old one used to be red. Is there a reason? Like, was the original one that color, or just change of taste?
I think the feeling was that the red carpet was very bright and really took away from all that wonderful dark wood, and so the green was a more subtle choice, I think. Rabbi Morris, is that right?
I think that is right, but I would just add that originally there was no carpet.
Yeah.
So there is no, if you look at the old kind of images we have, the interior, there hadn't been a carpet historically speaking. So the whole thing is a bit of an addition. So I think the idea was, okay, we'll maintain kind of this new thing of having the carpet. It helps a bit with the noise levels in terms of people walking up and down the aisles. but do it in a bit more subdued kind of way, and in a color scheme that matched other colors within the synagogue. Red doesn't really appear any otherwise in terms of the fabric of the building. And so green does appear on the hechal and on some of the pillars. So the idea was to try to find something that blended a bit more with the color scheme of the building.
Thank you. Can I just make a couple of comments, because I can see there's a member of the De Paz family here, and I think, Marilyn, weren't you saying that Frank De Paz's uniform will be on display? He's one of the Jews who won the Victoria Cross, which is the sort of highest British medal for gallantry. Ton, are there more questions?
No.
Here, just a couple more. I'm sorry, I'm a member, and this is like a kid in the candy store. First of all, I just want to comment for people perhaps who don't know Bevis that well. It now has central heating that actually warms you when you're in the synagogue in winter. It's just absolutely wonderful compared to how it used to be. And also, actually, there's new prayer books for Shabbat, which also are very, very good. Previously, we would have to like go backwards and forwards the whole time, and now we can just go in one direction throughout the service, which makes it much easier. Todd, I think there were some more comments on here. Perhaps whilst you're looking, we have somebody on YouTube with an Ashkenazi surname from Barbados, but with Sephardic ancestry. If you can get a male relative of Sephardic ancestry to contact the Avatenu DNA project, I'm sure they'll be very happy to hear from you. That's making a collection of DNA of men of Western Sephardic ancestry. Ton, is there anybody?
No, not directly relevant to the subject.
Okay, well, we've overextended by 25 minutes, shall we? Oh, sorry. Bernard, you have your hand up again, so quickly.
Yeah, just a quickie. I was listening from hospital to the Avateno project group on Clubhouse, at which Adam Brown and Randy Schoenberg were talking, and the work they are doing and the discoveries that they are making are so exciting that if anybody has got a spare Sephardic male relative who they could contribute to the Y-DNA project, please, I won't say dig them up because that's probably too late, but please hand them over, because the stuff that they are discovering about the worldwide reach of Jewish DNA, or at least Jewish male DNA, and the stuff that they are discovering about the evolution of the Sephardim is so important. I know it doesn't directly relate to this, but since David raised it, I wanted to say. And for anybody who can manage to fit that in between other groups that are all at the same time on Sunday, that particular Clubhouse group is worth listening to. Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, Adam is on this call, and also he works with Michael Was and Raquel Levy-Toledano, and hopefully all three of them and Randy Schoenberg will be in London for the genealogical conference. So please attend. Ton, would you like to make any final comments or close the meeting?
No, let's close shop. And I wish to thank, first of all, Marilyn Scott,
yes,
and Rabbi Shalom Morris for their contribution this evening. I wish to thank our patrons who make all of this possible, and our viewers on YouTube. Next week, we will have another collaborator of Adam Brown, Wim Pennings, and he will talk about the basics of DNA research. And we hope to see you all next week.